At 6:50 on a Thursday morning, I sat at my usual booth at the roadside diner off Route 9, and when Wanda rang up my breakfast, $9 and change, my card came back declined. I'm Harlan Duffy, 72 years old, and before I tell you what happened after that little beep, tell me where you're watching from tonight in the comments. Hit like, hit subscribe, and if you've ever spent decades building something quietly, mile by mile, only to have your own family decide you become a burden to manage instead of a man to ask, you already know exactly where this story is going. Wanda had been serving me the same eggs and toast every Thursday for almost 11 years, since before her hair went fully gray. She tried the card twice, then gave me the gentle, apologetic look every waitress in this country eventually learns to give an old man holding up her register. Not going through, Harlan. Want to try another one? Try it again, I said. She did. Declined again. I told her I'd square up next time, left a 5 and some ones I had folded in my shirt pocket, and walked out to my truck. I sat there in the parking lot a good long while before I called my daughter, Renata. She picked up on the third ring, her voice carrying that particular rehearsed brightness people use when they've been dreading a call and hoping it wouldn't come yet. Hey, Dad. My card got declined at the diner, Renata. $9. A pause, then careful words, the kind a person practices in their head before they ever say them out loud. Yeah, so, Cole and I sat down with a financial planner last month. We put you on a fixed monthly budget, just to make sure things stretch properly. There's probably a hold while the new account settles in. I sat very still behind the wheel. A fixed budget. On my money. We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Dad. A trucker's pension isn't a whole lot to stretch across the rest of your life, especially if your health ever takes a turn. We're trying to plan responsibly. In the background, I heard my son-in-law's voice, not lowered at all. Just tell him it's for his own good. He'll come around. Renata didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. I heard it clean enough through the phone. I understand, I said. Thank you. And I hung up, because 38 years hauling freight across every interstate in this country taught me exactly one thing above everything else: the moment you feel the urge to lay on the horn is exactly the moment you should ease off the gas instead. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to my property manager's office. Let me tell you who I actually am, because it matters for everything that follows. I drove long-haul freight for 38 years, starting in 1975 with a rusted-out Kenworth I bought second-hand and a route that took me from Ohio down through the Carolinas and back, week after week, year after year, until my knees finally told me it was time to park the rig for good in 2013. It was hard, lonely, honest work, sleeping in cabs at rest stops, missing more birthdays than I care to remember, and it never paid what people imagine. Even at the top of my seniority, I never cleared much more than $55,000 a year. What almost nobody in my family fully understood, because I never once sat them down and explained it, is that starting in 1986, after 11 years on the road and a decent chunk of savings finally built up, I bought my first rental property, a small 2-bedroom foreclosure in a town I used to pass through regularly on my route, for $18,000 cash. I fixed it up myself during my days off, rented it out, and used the income to buy a second one 3 years later. Then a third. I kept driving my route the whole time, using the long hours on the road to think through numbers, calling my property manager from truck stop payphones back before cell phones, then later from the cab itself. Over 30 years, quietly, one property at a time, mostly in towns along my old routes where prices stayed low and rent stayed steady, I built a portfolio of 14 rental houses. After the mortgage on the last one was paid off 6 years ago, those 14 properties, managed by a small firm I trust completely, generate a little over $11,000 a month in net rental income, on top of my modest pension and Social Security. I never talked about it. My late wife, Doreen, who passed 9 years ago from ovarian cancer, knew the general shape of what we'd built, since we made most of those purchase decisions together over the kitchen table between my halls, but even she and I rarely discussed the exact total, because neither of us cared for talking numbers at length. It felt private, almost superstitious, like discussing it too much might jinx it. My daughter Renata grew up believing her father was, in her own words during a difficult stretch in her 20s, just a trucker who was never around, which was true in the sense that it described my job and my long absences, and entirely false in the sense that she believed it defined the limit of what those long absences had actually built. Renata married Cole Bradbury 14 years ago. Cole manages a regional car dealership, a hard-working, occasionally overconfident man who has called me Harlan for 14 years, never Dad, which I never bothered correcting, the same way I never correct people who assume an old trucker eating alone at a diner counter must be counting every dollar in his pocket. About 8 months ago, Cole started helping with my finances. It began small and reasonable sounding, the way these things always seem to. He noticed I still handled most things with paper statements and a checkbook, old habits from decades on the road without reliable internet, and offered to set up online banking to make things simpler. I let him, mostly to please Renata, and because I've genuinely never cared much for smartphones. He linked accounts, reset passwords, for security, and gradually took on more administrative access than I fully tracked at the time. I trusted him completely. He was my daughter's husband and the father of my 2 grandchildren. I want to tell you about the moment I should have paid closer attention to, because I've turned it over in my mind many times since. About 5 months ago, at a family barbecue in my own backyard, I mentioned that my hip had been giving me trouble climbing into my truck. My grandson Dylan, 16, said to his mother, not unkindly, just carelessly the way teenagers do, "Grandpa's really slowing down, huh? Is he gonna need assisted living eventually?" Renata gave some vague answer I didn't fully catch over the sound of the grill. I let it pass. Hips hurt eventually. It seemed like nothing at the time. I didn't think about that exchange again until 3 weeks ago, when I arrived at Renata and Cole's house for what I believed was an ordinary Sunday dinner, and instead found something waiting on their kitchen table that would occupy the next several months of my life in ways I never could have anticipated. Cole sat at the head of the table with a manila folder squared precisely in front of him, the exact posture of a man who has rehearsed something and wants the folder noticed before he is. Renata stood near the stove, back half turned. Dylan leaned against the doorway, and my granddaughter Paige, 12, sat quietly at the island doing homework. "Harlan," Cole said. "Sit down. There's something important we need to go over." I sat across from him. He slid the folder across the table. Inside was a formal proposal, professionally prepared, suggesting I sell my house, listed in the document as my primary and only significant asset, and move into an assisted living facility, with the proceeds, managed carefully by the family, to fund long-term care. Beneath it sat a durable power of attorney form, already partially filled in, naming Cole Bradbury as agent. I read every line twice before I said a word, because 38 years navigating difficult stretches of interstate at 3 in the morning taught me the same lesson boardrooms teach executives: the man who speaks first in a tense room usually loses control of it. "What exactly has prompted this?" I said finally. Cole shifted. "Harlan, you're 72. A trucker's pension and social security aren't going to stretch far if something happens health-wise, especially with your hip. We're trying to plan responsibly before there's a crisis, not after. By listing my house as my only significant asset," I said, without ever asking me what my actual assets are. "This is standard elder care planning," Renata said from the stove. "We talked to a consultant, Dad. This is what responsible families do." I closed the folder and set both hands flat on the table. "Has this been reviewed by an attorney representing my interests specifically, or is this something a consultant sold you based on assumptions about what an old trucker probably has to his name?" The silence answered that question far more clearly than words could have. "I appreciate," I said, standing slowly, gathering my jacket, "that you believe you're acting out of concern. I need time to think about this." "Dad, don't make this difficult," Renata said, finally turning from the stove, her eyes bright and unhappy. "It stopped being simple," I said, "the moment you drafted paperwork about my one and only asset without ever asking me what I actually own." I drove home through the darkening streets with the radio off, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the old, familiar clarity I used to feel navigating a bad stretch of black ice at 4 in the morning, not anger, which I'd watched ruin more than one good driver's judgment over the decades, but something quieter and more dangerous to whoever stood on the other side of it, the specific stillness of a man who has just realized he is being profoundly underestimated by the people who claim to know him best. The next morning, I drove to see Marjorie Kessling, the property manager who'd handled my 14 rentals for the better part of 2 decades, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I trusted completely. I also called an elder law attorney she recommended, a careful, direct man named Owen Bashano. "Mr. Duffy," Owen said during our first call, "I want to be honest with you. A family drafting an assisted living proposal around the assumption that your house is your only significant asset, without ever confirming your actual financial picture, and pushing a power of attorney alongside it, that's a pattern worth taking very seriously. I'd like a full review of any account access changes made over the last year before we go any further." Over the following 3 weeks, Owen and Marjorie worked together and discovered that Cole, using login access I'd granted him months earlier for helping with online banking, had contacted my primary bank requesting information about consolidating my accounts, and had separately reached out to a realtor to get a preliminary valuation on my house, all without informing me. More troubling, Marjorie found that someone had contacted her office directly, identifying himself as Harlan's son-in-law, handling things on his behalf, requesting detailed rental income statements for all 14 properties, a request Marjorie had wisely declined without my direct written authorization. He was fishing for the real numbers, Marjorie told me over coffee at her office. Whether he knew the properties existed already or was just trying to figure out if there was more to you than the house, I honestly can't say. But somebody wanted a fuller picture, and they wanted it without asking you directly. I documented everything in a notebook, an old habit from decades of keeping careful logbooks for every mile, every load, every delivery. Every comment, every visit, every careless remark spoken in front of me as though I couldn't hear it, dated and recorded exactly as spoken. I invited Renata and Cole to my house the following Sunday evening. "There are things I need to go over with you both," I told Renata on the phone. "Dad, is everything okay?" "Everything is about to be very clear," I said. They arrived at 6. Owen sat quietly at the end of my dining table, introduced simply as, "my attorney," a phrase that visibly unsettled both of them the instant I said it. "Your attorney?" Cole repeated. "Owen and I have been working together the last few weeks," I said. "Please, sit." I opened my own folder in the center of the table, exactly where Cole's had sat 3 weeks earlier. "First," I said, "I want you both to see this." I slid a printed rental income summary across the table, 14 properties listed clearly, each with its monthly net income. Renata picked it up, read it, and went pale. $11,000 a month, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, what is this?" "This," I said, "is 14 rental houses I've bought and paid off over 30 years, starting back in 1986, using money I earned driving freight and never touched otherwise. Your mother and I built this together, quietly, one property at a time, while I was still out on the road." Cole stared at the paper, his face losing color. 14 houses? "Harlan, we had no idea." "You never asked," I said quietly. "You assumed a trucker's pension meant a trucker's savings, and you drafted an entire care plan around selling the one house you knew about, without ever once verifying whether that was actually my only asset." Cole put both hands over his face for a long moment. When he lowered them, his eyes were wet, and I want to be fair to him here, because what came next did not feel like performance to me. "I convinced myself I was being the responsible one," he said slowly. "I saw the old truck, the modest house, the trucker's pension, and I filled in the rest with worst-case assumptions. I never once thought to actually ask you what you'd built over your career." He looked at Renata. "I told you I'd looked into things properly." "You told me the consultant confirmed the plan made sense," Renata said slowly. "You never said you'd actually asked Dad directly what he had." "I never asked him," Cole admitted. Not really. I let that settle in the room, because there is nothing more useful than allowing people to hear their own admissions spoken aloud without anyone rushing to soften them. I'm not here tonight to file anything against either of you, I said. Owen can tell you, we could, given the unauthorized inquiries made to my bank and my property manager. But that isn't what I want. I closed the folder. What I want is for this family to understand that concern is not the same thing as control, and love does not give anyone the right to quietly plan another adult's life around assumptions they never bother to verify. Renata was crying quietly now. I let it happen, she said. I saw the comments Dylan made, I saw Cole talking to consultants, and I told myself it was easier to go along with it than push back. I know, I said gently. That's often exactly how it happens. Not one great betrayal. A dozen small agreements to stay quiet. We talked for nearly 2 more hours that evening. I told them I had revoked Cole's account access, that Marjorie had been instructed never to release information about my properties to anyone without my direct written consent, and that I would not pursue any formal complaint as long as nothing like this happened again without an honest conversation first. Before they left, Dylan, who had been sitting quietly on the stairs the whole evening, came into the kitchen. Grandpa, he said, I didn't know any of that. About the houses. I know you didn't. I said that stuff about assisted living. In front of people. I'm sorry. You repeated what the adults around you were saying, I said. That's not entirely on you. But I hope you remember, next time you hear someone talk about an older person that way, that there's usually a lot more to the story than one house and a modest pension. The months that followed weren't dramatic. There was no single grand reconciliation scene. Cole called himself, without Renata prompting him, about 2 weeks later, and asked if he could take me to breakfast, just the two of us, at the same diner where all of this began. We sat in a booth for nearly 2 hours. He asked me real questions, for the first time in 14 years, about the properties, about how I'd found each one, about what it had actually felt like buying that first foreclosure in 1986 with money I'd saved hauling freight. Not performed curiosity. Real questions. I think, he said toward the end, turning his coffee cup slowly, I got so focused on planning for a version of your future I'd already decided was inevitable, that I stopped seeing you as someone with a whole life I didn't fully understand yet. I just saw an old pension and a house that needed managing. That's the danger of good intentions, I told him. They rarely feel like arrogance from the inside. Renata started calling more often, not to check on my hip, but simply to talk, the way we used to before all this began. Dylan started asking me about my old routes, about the properties, genuinely curious in a way that surprised me. Paige, 12 years old, asked if she could see photographs of the houses when I bought them, back before I fixed them up, fascinated by the transformation. About a year after that Thursday morning at the diner, I sat back down in my usual booth. Wanda rang up the same breakfast, $9 and change. 9:20, Harlan, she said. The card went through without a sound, no hesitation, no red light, no quiet embarrassment at the counter. Just an ordinary transaction on an ordinary morning. As I walked out to my truck, my phone buzzed. A text from Dylan, coming by Saturday, want you to show me the spreadsheet for the properties. Thinking about this stuff for my own future too. I smiled, climbed into my old truck, and drove home through the quiet morning light, thinking about 30 years of quiet, patient decisions nobody had ever thought to ask me about. The lesson I carry out of all this is not complicated, though it took 38 years on the road and one very difficult season inside my own family to fully understand it. Loving someone does not give you the right to decide, quietly and without asking, what they have or what they need. Real respect means asking the harder question directly, even when assuming feels faster and easier in the moment. And sometimes the people who most need reminding of what you've actually built are the ones who love you most, and simply forgot to ask before they started planning your life around assumptions they never verified. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, a parent, a grandparent, or perhaps even yourself, I hope you'll remember to ask before you assume. And if it moved you, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribed for more stories about family, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to demand to be asked instead of managed.